Welcome to our session today from Content Management to Content Services with Spring Boot Data and Content. Thank you all for coming. Hope you're having a good Spring 1 2018 so far. My name's Paul Warren. I'm from a small division within DellEMC called the Cloud Platform team, and we focus on open source. I'm permanently based in the Pivotal office in San Francisco, working on Cloud Foundry, and what we're here to talk to you today about, which is a Spring project we're incubating called Spring Content. I'm delighted to be joined on stage by one of our partners, Doug Hoke.
Thanks. I am Doug Hoke. I work for Cardinal Health. It's a big company nobody usually knows about. I am an enterprise architect whose fundamental drawings are DevOps platforms and everything open source. And I'm happy to be participating in this incubation with them.
Thanks, Doug. So standard disclaimer, everything we tell you here today is subject to change, although we'll try our best not to, obviously. Okay, so open source is, I think everyone agree, is fairly ubiquitous. It's everywhere now. Linux operating system is powering everyone's cloud, including Microsoft's. As DellEMC, we recognize this. You guys may think of DellEMC as a hardware company, but we're also a software company, and we're involved in many of these major open source initiatives. We're corporate sponsors of the Linux Foundation and of Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF, which is the home of Kubernetes, obviously. Our parent company, Dell Technologies, is an 80% owner of approximately of VMware and Pivotal. And Pivotal obviously is the reason that we're all here today, and Pivotal are the major sponsors behind open source projects, Cloud Foundry, and the secret source underneath that, Bosch. We have guys in our storage units divisions doing commits into things like Kubernetes to add our storage drivers in there, and we're also involved in with Google and Mesos and Docker defining standards called CSI, or the Container Storage Interface, that will really define how storage moving forward will talk to these container orchestrators. So you write your storage module once and it should run in all of these different container orchestrators unchanged. And obviously we're here to talk about the Spring project that we're incubating called Spring Content. So how did I get here? I spent 15 years prior to my current gig, plus actually, working at Documentum. And over that time, I saw a lot of change. We went from being a document management company through to being a slightly more generic content management company. Around 2006, we were bought by EMC. And then about 18 months ago, we sold Documentum off to OpenText. So a lot of change. Over those 15 years, I worked on quite a bit of stuff there. I poked around in the server. I worked on their foundation classes, which was the main Java software development kit for building applications on top of Documentum. I worked on the web development kit. I worked on portalizing the web development kit so it would run on JSR 168 portal servers, if anyone remembers those. Worked on their main web-based client called WebTop. And I spent quite a few years working on their Eclipse-based tooling. The whole point of that was to try and make it easy to write applications on top of Documentum. So this taught me quite a lot of stuff. Taught me how ECM platforms are built. And essentially, they're an ORM, right? They're an object relational mapping built around three central concepts. The first of which obviously is content, the documents that you want to store. And all of the content management systems just store that on the file system. Around that, they wrap metadata, and that metadata is 9 times out of 10 stored in a relational database. And then to that, we add content search, or the ability to look inside the documents and match them against the search terms. And usually that's farmed out to a third-party provider. Back in the day, we used Autonomy, and now as we move forward, we moved to the Lucene-based Apache Solr. And if you look in the clouds now, you'll see things like Elasticsearch, but they all do the same basic thing. This taught me how the ECM vendors think about the world. So the ECM vendors think that ECM is a platform like ERP is a platform. They believe in this single enterprise repository where you put all of your company's documents and you access them in there. And this thinking, the trouble with this is when you build applications that have to handle content, right, they're line of business applications, but this single enterprise repository thinking means that you have to integrate your application onto the ECM platform. And I spent 15 years there, I worked on the tooling. I can tell you that even we had trouble building applications on top of Documentum. And if we were the vendors were having trouble, what problem were our customers having? What trouble were our customers having? So I started ruminating. I was thinking, well, I wonder if this thinking is flawed. I wonder if ECM is not a platform like ERP is a platform. I wonder if it's more of a strategy, a practice, and a principle that all your applications should uphold. I started to really question this single enterprise repository concept, wondering, is this a fallacy? Especially when you look at how it changed over time. We went from document management through to slightly more generic content management, where we were managing websites and doing some things to convert XML to HTML and back again. And then as the social media thing kicked in a little bit after that, we were doing things like digital asset management, where we were doing interesting things with video. And then on top of that, way back when I started there, we had a single Windows application called Workspace, which is how you access the content repository. A little bit later after that, around the time of the web, we had laptops everywhere and we were having to push this content out to websites. And then after that, obviously, we got smartphones and people were expecting their content to be delivered to them on their tablet and their smartphone apps. And the single enterprise repository didn't solve this problem particularly well. So I was thinking, well, perhaps everyone's got this wrong. Perhaps we shouldn't be integrating the applications onto the ECM platform. Perhaps we should flip this thing 100% on its head and integrate the content management into the applications instead. Around that same time, there were some interesting things happening elsewhere within the EMC Federation. I mentioned EMC owned VMware and now Dell owns VMware. VMware, I don't know if you remember, bought SpringSource. SpringSource were the creators of Spring. And that caused me to look at that again. And I realized that it was no longer the XML configured IOC container that I had seen some 10 years prior. Nowadays, it was this framework that you used to build cloud-native applications, cloud-native microservices with cool new projects like Spring Boot that embedded an application server, gave you a runnable jar. It was kind of like a microservice in a tin. And also interesting projects like Spring Data that was really delivering on the promise that Spring had all along to let the developer forget about the boilerplate code that you write for every application, because Spring's got you covered there, and you just focus on the business value. This ability of Spring Data to allow you just to define a Java interface and for it to inject database implementations into that, I thought was really, really unique and very, very powerful concept. Really giving developers velocity. And so putting all that together, Spring Content was effectively born. I thought to myself, well, I wonder if I can take my 15 plus years of content management history and combine that with the Spring ecosystem, which was lacking any content management semantics at all, to deliver not only content management, but to deliver content services into the hands of developers who then had the freedom of choice to choose where they wanted to store the content. They weren't necessarily tied into storing it in components that the content management vendor had chosen on their behalf. So what am I talking about? How does this actually work? So Spring Content is just a Spring library like all of the other Spring libraries. It can, in fact, be used on its own, but we think it's best when combined with other projects from the Spring ecosystem. So we would suggest that you start off with a Spring Boot application from start.spring.io. And then next to that, you make some choices about storage. Going back to those 3 tenets I was talking about earlier, you make a choice about where you want to store your content. Now, you may wish to store that on the file system in something like DellEMC's Isilon, our network attack storage. Or you may want to store it in something slightly newer, like an object store, in which case you could use DellEMC's ECS, or any of the others that are out there, right? You make that choice. You then make a choice about where you want to store the metadata that wraps that content. And again, you're free to choose a relational database, in which case you'd be choosing JPA stuff. Or you may choose a newer NoSQL type database, and you'd add the relevant dependencies to that. With those storage choices made, all you then need to do in your Spring Boot project is define a class which models the data you want to store and associate content with. You then define an interface for storing your content, and you define a second interface for storing your metadata. And that's all you need to do to get a runnable content service. That if you chose newer cloud-native components, will outscale a Documentum or a FileNet or an Alfresco or an OpenText any day of the week. And you got that at the cost of defining one class and two interfaces. And the magic there is when you start the Spring Content app, we'll look at the storage choices that you made, and then we'll look at the interfaces that tell us what you want to store, and then we'll inject implementations of those interfaces for you, meaning that you don't have to write them yourself. Moreover, we'll then inject REST endpoints on top of those interfaces, meaning you have an API that's callable from the outside world, meaning you then have a content service. And of course, this is all pushable to PCF, where you can run it as a cloud-native app, and you can scale it up and scale it down, because it follows the 12 factors, and it's stateless, and all that good stuff. It doesn't just stop there, though, because in content management applications, you very often need things like renditions, where you take content in one format, and you want to push it out in another format. That's easy to do with Spring Content. It follows the same pattern. You add a dependency on Spring Content renditions, you go back to your storage interface, you update it just to say that you want to make it renderable, and Spring Content will then also inject an implementation of that and REST endpoints on top of that as well. Full text indexing, same deal. You add a dependency on Spring Content for Apache Solr. You then go and update your storage interface to say that you want to make it searchable, and we'll inject REST endpoints and an implementation for that too. Locking and versioning, same deal. This is experimental right now, but it's there and it's working, and we're looking to have that on the tip of master towards the end of the year, where we will try on 1.0. And then lastly, there's lots of cool natural language processing services out there from the clouds, and these are really easy to also bind in. So it's not supported out the box. However, we have a good event-based mechanism, just like Spring Data does. So it's very easy to write a class with the right annotations that take the content that you just stored, perhaps uses the rendition service to extract text out of that, and ship it off to Google, who will return you whatever you want. Like, they'll use the NLP to classify it for you, or to extract the entity and organization information, or to give you sentiment. And of course, these results you get back from one of those services then just becomes additional metadata that you store around your content, really bringing the extra meaning to the content and making that content work for you and your organization. So this is a fairly new project. We're in incubation phase, right? We've been going a couple of years. We've got some GitHub stars and forks. We're getting about 6,000 downloads a month. And that represents about a 500% growth year on year. We're being used by some fairly big names. And I'm delighted to hand over to Doug Hoke, who's going to explain a little bit about their journey on digital transformation and how they're using Spring Content in their organization. Thanks, Doug.
Oh. So you're probably wondering what I was doing back there, just kind of, I don't know. And I will say I did help make some of those slides, because that's what architects do. We make pictures. So there's a lot of questions that get asked of, different people in IT and enterprises, right? And how do we go to the cloud? How do we do DevOps? How do we embrace Agile? How do we go faster? And as an architect, I have to take all these questions and say, what's real and what can we do, and how can we benefit ourselves from not just thinking we know it, but learning and taking best practices. So really, how does the corporate world emulate the good things about the West Coast, like Pivotal and DellEMC? Well, there's lots of different ways we can do it, but one of the things that a lot of large enterprises are is a little tentative on open source, even though we're consuming it all the time, right? So very first slide, we talked about Linux. We're all using Linux distros, right? That's open source. So I'm gonna just pick this up and just hold it. It is worse. Is it better now? I'm just gonna use a podium. All right, can you hear me now? Cool. So what I try to do is envision how can I categorize things, because that's how I try to understand things, and then how do I pass it on to other people in the enterprise, whether it's leadership or technical implementers, right? And so I looked at open source as, well, there's three ways of doing this. There's consumers, which a lot of us are, and then there's contributors and creators. The main thing about consuming is that you have to make sure you partner with your security, and you take all the dependencies that you're literally deploying onto your real production world, and maybe not production world, and make sure that you understand where those vulnerabilities are and reduce your attack vectors, right? So if another OpenSSL Heartbleed happens, you know where those are deployed, and you can go take full attack methods on it and remove them, right? And so that's good. And Cardinal Health's pretty good at consuming, and we're pretty good at making sure we're being secure, and we're pretty sure that we're doing the right things to take advantage of open source solutions. But one of the things that we're lacking is that in order for us to make that step to becoming creators and actually creating projects that can be consumed, we need to contribute. And this is where people like Paul, who are actually creators, I love reaching out to them, right? So one of the questions that was asked of us is, how can we simplify middleware? Well, I'm an implementer of ECM and many other things, and so I said, well, let me go out to Google and find a solution that might be worth it, right? So Alfresco always jumps up, and there's a lot of other solutions out there. And I go, hey, wait a minute. We use BCF. We love Spring. I just found something called Spring Content. Well, let me reach out to Paul. So I reached out to Paul, and Paul was very gracious, and he's literally sat down with our existing ECM team and is teaching them how to write RESTful APIs, take advantage of Spring REST, Spring Data to make Spring Content. And so, what are we trying to do with Spring Content? Well, we're not going in full bore. We're not going to say this replaces everything. But I agree with the sentiment of not only Paul, but Gartner saying ECM's kind of not important anymore. It's enterprise content services. That's why we need to look at it. So when I see the ability for us to add these feature sets of NLP and Solar or Elasticsearch or whatever that back-end system needs to be to give you that feature, I say, okay, this is something we should take advantage of. And so if you look, this is kind of where we are right now. So we live in two clouds in Cardinal Health, GCP and Amazon. And the neat thing about PCF is it means I can just have my PCF running on either one, and my app is CF push, it's there, right? And this is great, right? Because now I don't have to solve all the infrastructure stuff every time. And then I go, okay, let's take this Spring Content, let's work with Paul, let's make Paul let us be smarter and contribute to his project to help make it better. And then we're putting API RESTful interfaces on top of it, right? So yes, we get it out of the box, but we like to use a gateway on top, so if we need to yet leverage some kind of control to say you're only allowed 100 gets, or if I want to make sure that you're passing a JOT token beforehand, those are the things that we're leveraging it for. And so over time, what I really want us to do is be able to take this monolithic ECM system and reduce the footprint of it, so now I've simplified middleware, and now we have end services. Now, regardless if it's the same ECM team who's writing these services or makes repeatable services that can be consumed, it's great, but also it gives the ability for my app developers who live in many different places of the world to be able to take advantage of a project like this and provide this need. So, I'm kind of done talking about what Cardinal Health was trying to do with this, So I'm going to hand it back over to Paul to talk about what his future's direction is and some of the things you can help out with contributing to it if you'd like to. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Doug. That was excellent. So where are we going moving forward? So internal roadmap. We're looking to 1.0 this towards the end of the year. Once we've got locking and versioning hardened. And after that will represent a pretty decent feature-rich baseline. So at that point, we're going to look at producing a Spring Content for ECS module. So this will be sit beside our Spring Content for S3 that we already have, which is a generic module for S3 storage. The Spring Content ECS will expose some of the clever things that we can do in ECS that other S3 object stores can't do. Things like retention policies and clever byte range requests, and so on. Which leads me to my second point. In highly regulated industries, content management applications usually have to have some sort of retention. So we're looking to build like a generic retention service, an API for that, and that's what we'll key into with the Dell content for ECS module. We're working with the Spring team. We'd love to see some of these storage modules start surfacing in the Spring Initializer project. For those who don't know what that is, that's start.spring.io, where you go to create your initial Spring Boot project and start developing. So we'd like to see our Spring content for ECS, Spring content for Isilon, our other generic Spring content modules for storage start surfacing in there to make it really easy for people to consume. And then lastly, microservices means that we have more of these applications that we're running. So we envisage lots of these things cropping up. So we'd like to investigate using things like Istio. Perhaps we'll produce like an Istio sidecar that you can load again next to each Spring Content service that will report back to like a single pane of glass dashboard so that you have a single view of all of your content services running in your company. That will probably allow you to do some simple administration functions, like perhaps lock a whole folder or swathe of documents because you need to prevent them from being modified for whatever reason, or apply retention policies, or delete documents after they've expired from their retention policy and they're safe to delete. Perhaps we'll try and do that from a single enterprise dashboard. So these are the sorts of things we're planning internally. If you wish to get involved, we'd love to have more help. There's plenty of ways you can get involved. If there's a storage out there that we don't currently support, Spring Content is open source, it's in GitHub. Go look at how the existing ones work. Reach out to us. We'll quite happily work with you, try and make that work for your storage backend. We'd love an integral part of most content management is some sort of workflow, usually like that involves humans, all right? And we've deliberately stayed away from doing BPM because there's loads of good engines out there. We'd love to see some integrations with some of the newer cloud-native BPM engines, like the one from the flowable.org guys that looks really cool. So we'd love to see that. We also think the programming model for Spring Content is powerful in its own right and could bring velocity to the old guard. So we'd love to see a Spring Content for Documentum, a Spring Content for Alfresco, for OpenText, for FileNet. Then, in my 15 years history, I never heard of a single customer that bought Documentum and just deployed Documentum. Everyone customized it to build their line of business applications on top, their invoice management, purchase orders, insurance claim, My Doctor, whatever it was. So there's loads of vertical industries and loads of applications out there that need content, and they all have very similar patterns. So we'd love to see some of these verticals start appearing, sort of reusable content, Spring Content object models. Perhaps for insurance claims, perhaps for case management, something in life sciences. That would be great. And of course, on a slightly smaller side, I spoke of Spring Content for renditions that will take content in one format and put it out in another. We can always do more renderers. So we'd love to see more renderers, especially around the ASPOSE libraries or something like that. And there's a small chance that there may be a bug here or there, right? Although it is test-driven and all that good stuff. But if you do find a bug, please report it. Even better, please help us fix it. Sign the relevant CLAs, and we can get that committed into the code and so on. So that's about it. I think we've covered everything. This has been a slidey presentation. Is there actually any meat behind this? If you wish to see Spring content in action, I'm doing an expert session at the DellEMC booth tomorrow at 1, but I hang around that booth all the time, so if I'm there, come find me. I will code up a Spring content service with you in about half an hour that runs against DellEMC Isilon, DellEMC ECS to show you how easy it is in reality. And that'll be a live coding demo. Well, in reality, it'll be a live uncommenting session, but you get the point. So please come and find me. I'd love to take you guys through it. With that, I think I'd like to hand it over for questions. If anyone has any questions. Yes?
So one of the things I noticed that wasn't really addressed was security. Are you considering like using Spring Security,
yep.
Metadata, and letting the app roll its own security, or
yep.
is there any plans on integrating some sort of security model in there so that, you know, one owner doesn't allow another owner to
right.
content, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was about security. What do you do with security? So that's one of the areas we deliberately stayed away from because there is a Spring security. So actually at the booth, for the locking and versioning, we do introduce Spring security, and that's how we solve it there. We're only using like basic security for that, but the point is we use Spring security, and you can use whatever Spring security supports, most likely OAuth 2. I think Cardinal Health are using OAuth.
Right, so what we're doing at Cardinal Health is we're making sure that the claim and the scopes meet the sufficient needs and allowing Spring Security to say, are you really allowed to come in, right? So you have to have that JOT to be able to come in and actually access it. Now, what does it mean to get down to really, really complex use cases? Because a lot of times people would make an entity for, let's say, an invoice, and they'd put every customer's invoices in there, and then they'd make rules based on the attribute values to allow you, if you can see your customer invoices or not somebody else's. So we didn't break it down to that level yet because we haven't felt the need for it yet. But yeah, we're following OAuth 2 specs and making sure that before you even come in, you have to have that JOT token. Okay, now that you're in, we're going to leverage Spring Security and make sure that everything is good. We also leverage Okta to help make the OAuth flows work as well. So, I mean, we're not writing it all from scratch, and we're taking advantage of many tools and open source projects along the way to make sure we can make sure we're as secure as possible. Now, I will say that, again, at a pilot mode, we are just locking it down for this unique use case. One of the things that we will do is when we pass it in the best practice to other application developers, that they follow that same exact pattern.
Yeah, it's a great question actually, because back in Documentum land, it's all ACL based. In the world today, right, we're all RBAC, role-based access control based, or that's the current thinking. So actually, we have chatted as we move forward with this pilot project. We're going to investigate product that a little bit and find out where we are, because RBAC obviously fits very well with OAuth 2, but there are some proper use cases in document management for ACLs. But then there is a Spring ACL project that is very much reinvigorated. It had languished a little bit, but I noticed that there's actually a lot of recent activity on it. So I'm potentially thinking of pairing with that for ACL stuff.
Yeah, our big security headache is the search. We actually have to have secure search because some documents can't be searched by other people.
Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, cool. Yes, the question at the back?
Yeah, on that search, so it has a lot of content types at some point, so you have to be spinning up many of those separate services. What's your view on that, having some kind of unified search across all those things? Can you achieve that in some way?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's one of the things we want to look at on our internal roadmap. So I haven't got much past the thinking stage on this one, but I would like to see if I can use something like Istio. You know, like it's like that. Istio is like the next generation service discovery. It's like a service mesh. Essentially what it is, though, it's a little proxy that sits by the side of all of your services and then can do whatever you want it to do. In our case, we'd have it reporting back to like another central server, which we probably, so we'd probably create the Spring Boot server, we'd probably create the sidecar, and that would enable us, that would sit along each content service and report back. And then that would allow us to create like a single pane dashboard type thing.
Then see that as like a distributed search across all those.
Exactly right. And then,
Approach could be a central search index.
right.
See that as a good idea.
So I think I didn't,
You can also set up a central search index probably.
You could.
we could do aggregated search and things like that,
I
absolutely.
mean, if you do, you just have to say, I mean, storage is cheaper now than it's ever been, right? But now you're duplicating your storage, right? So if you do it where it's more of a composite, and you have a centralized entry point, and you say for this entry point, we're over a little bit, but for this entry point, go talk to these X searching indexes services, then that could facilitate it too, but you need to make it asynchronous, right? Is that part of it? No, but if you're a dev and you like to play, you could probably make it. If Paul wants to bake it in, he can probably figure out a way to do it as well.
I apologize if I didn't hear your question very well. I have very bad hearing. Anyone else for any questions? Nope.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Please.
I think we're about out of time, so we'll stop it there. I'll be at the booth. I can hang around here outside, so come and find me. Thanks very much for listening, everybody.